Something just shattered behind closed doors at Windsor Castle, and palace watchers are calling it the most terrifying royal moment in living memory. A king dropped to his knees in front of his daughter-in-law and begged for mercy. A queen consort was brutally forced out of her own home in the dead of night, and the person who made every single bit of it happen was Princess Anne, the late queen's most trusted daughter, the most feared woman in that family. Camilla never saw it coming. The British public was never told a word. What happened next is far darker than any of this.
So, what did Camilla actually do? Before we get to the explosive details of that night, we must first cover what she did to set it all in motion. What could she have possibly done that was so destructive it got her physically thrown out of Clarence House in the middle of the night? Because none of this was a random series of events. Every single thing that targeted her, she built herself. Brick by brick, poor decision by poor decision over so many decades. The first thing you must realise is that Camilla she had survived her entire royal career using one single method. She'd find a target to ruin, then leak vicious and poisonous stories about them to the papers. Then she would simply sit back and watch that person's life go up in flames. She'd done it her whole life, and she was a master at it. For years her strategy worked without a single hitch. But here's what multiple royal insiders allege: she didn't stop this game even when she finally became the queen consort. She just kept on going, and the very next target she chose would be the one that cost her absolutely everything. That person was Meghan Markle. When she entered the scene, the tabloids were baying for a new villain, and sources close to palace operations allege a senior aide with a direct line to Camilla's office became the main source feeding nasty stories about Meghan to the press. These were specific attacks designed to completely torpedo Meghan's credibility before she could get her feet under her inside the firm. And the single most destructive story of all was this one. In the days right before Meghan and Harry's royal wedding in 2018, a very tense argument broke out. The fight was between Meghan and Kate over the flower girl dresses for Princess Charlotte. According to insiders, Kate was so cutting during that argument that Meghan was the one who actually left the room in tears. But sources claim it was Camilla who took that truth and buried it deep, planting the opposite story in the press that Meghan was the one who made Kate cry. That single story completely torched Meghan's reputation overnight, and Princess Anne had been watching Camilla. She had watched her work the tabloid machine for 30 years. She had seen this exact pattern play out time and time again. She knew who always came out on top in this family, and she knew who got burned, and she mentally catalogued every single detail she witnessed. But believe it or not, that was just the opening act, because Camilla's second offence was the one that completely destroyed what little tolerance Anne had left for her. This time it happened inside the palace walls during the final months of Queen Elizabeth's life. In those last months, as the Queen was clearly fading and while the entire palace staff was quietly preparing for the inevitable, Camilla was busy making calls. She was actively lobbying for bigger ceremonial roles. She was angling for a major power upgrade, and not discreetly either. Not carefully at all. It was so blatant that multiple palace staff members saw everything and later reported it. She was building her own future while the monarch above her was still alive, still fighting, and still wearing the crown. One palace insider summed it up with a chilling phrase that no one who heard it has ever forgotten. He said vultures were circling while the Queen was still warm. That's exactly what it felt like inside those walls. And Princess Anne was right there inside those walls. Anne witnessed every single moment of it. Anne, who has given up more than the public will ever realise to protect the crown her mother wore, watched Camilla scheme around a dying woman and filed away every detail. But even that, as shocking as it was, wasn't the final straw that got Camilla thrown out of the house. Prince William had been watching Camilla too, when he started to restructure the royal households, operations partly due to his father's failing health and the urgent need to prepare the institution for the His team launched a full audit into how the monarchy's charitable funds were actually being allocated, and what they uncovered inside the Duchy of Cornwall accounts was the one detail that stopped everyone cold. Camilla had apparently been siphoning off significant duchy charity funds to causes directly linked to her own network of patronages, not just once but consistently, quietly building up what was essentially a private, financial empire right inside the monarchy's own charitable infrastructure, using the firm's money and the firm's name to grow her own personal sphere of influence. That single act was completely out of bounds. That was the moment William went from watching to acting, starting to build a plan to remove her. He teamed up with Anne. Together they gathered every piece of evidence. Then Anne walked straight up to Camilla, slammed the file on the table in front of her, stared her dead in the eye, and told her point blank that she was no longer welcome and that her time there was over. And Camilla, the woman who fought tooth and nail from mistress to queen, consort with just pure stubborn grit, had absolutely nothing to say back. For the first time in her entire royal career, every single survival tool she had ever learned was now useless. Anne wasn't there to negotiate or to warn anyone. No, she was there to finish. Something for good, and Camilla felt it in her bones. To understand why Anne was chosen for this moment, you need to grasp who Princess Anne truly is and the sheer weight she was carrying when she walked through that door. She was the woman who had never forgiven Camilla. Princess Anne doesn't act without reason. That is the first thing you must understand about her. She spent decades inside the British monarchy as the undisputed hardest-working royal in the family, the one the late Queen depended on more than anyone else when times got tough. She has never chased the press, never cared for public approval, and never made one move for the cameras or the headlines. She does the work, protects the family business, and avoids the drama, which is precisely what makes her the most formidable person in that family when she finally decides it's time to act. And she had been deciding what to do for a very long time. For years, Anne watched Camilla the way only someone who truly loves an institution can watch a person they believe is slowly gutting it from the inside out. She saw her mother's legacy being twisted and reshaped to centre a woman that Elizabeth had privately never ever fully accepted. No matter what the official photos and public appearances tried to suggest. Because here is what the public doesn't know. Insiders persistently claimed that in her final years, Queen Elizabeth privately wept over what Camilla's presence had done to the family's reputation and to the very institution she had spent her life protecting, not just once but many times. And Anne was present for those moments. Anne sat right there with her mother through all of it. She watched the woman who gave every single part of herself to the crown, who sacrificed her own privacy, her freedom, and every simple comfort most people take for granted sit therein. Total private devastation over a problem she couldn't speak of publicly and couldn't fix privately. That grief didn't leave Anne when her mother passed away. It became something else, something cold and sharp that sat inside her and waited for the perfect moment with absolute precision. That moment finally came when Prince William arrived, and you need to understand this very clearly. William didn't come to Anne as a nephew asking his aunt for a favour. He came as the future king of the United Kingdom with a single clear and urgent mission. He had decided that Camilla had to be removed from the centre of the monarchy for good, and he needed the only person in the family with the moral authority and the sheer iron will to finish the job. He went to Anne because she was the only one who could walk into that room and make it stick. And long before he ever knocked on her door, he had been working for months to ensure that when Anne did make her move, Camilla would have no power left to fight back. William had been playing chess inside that palace while the others were playing checkers. He had been quietly and methodically dismantling Camilla's entire support structure piece by careful piece. Budget allocations that once ran straight through Camilla's office were suddenly frozen. Royal patronages that grew under her influence had already been quietly reassigned. Correspondence for the king was being funneled through William's team, first giving him total visibility and control over what his father saw and what he did not. He was quietly stripping away her operational power, long before any direct confrontation ever happened. When the time was right, he brought in Anne, and she delivered. She dropped those files on Camilla's desk and left her utterly speechless. But Anne did not act, just on her own grief and judgment. She had known for years about something else hidden deep inside the Windsor, archives a sealed letter written by her own mother, just before she passed away, and that letter is what transforms this entire saga from a family feud into something far larger and infinitely more devastating. But before we open that letter, we must go back to Windsor Castle on that very same night, because as Anne delivered the final blow at Clarence House, something else was unfolding inside the castle walls, something so unbelievably shocking, so emotionally raw, that the few people who witnessed it are still whispering about what they saw weeks later. It was the night everything truly changed. It all started just after midnight at Windsor Castle, when Catherine arrived completely on her own. There was no security detail surrounding her, just her walking into the palace in the dead of night and waiting for her in a candle-lit chamber deep. Within the castle was King Charles, and here is the detail that will stop you cold in your tracks. Charles was. He was wearing no sovereign insignia, no crown, no robes, no ceremonial dress whatsoever, nothing that could identify him as the King of the United Kingdom. This was a deliberate and deeply personal choice. A king who walked into that room as a man first, because what he was about to do meant leaving every symbol of his authority outside that door. What finally broke Charles enough to reach this point was a private report. It was compiled by palace physicians and senior aides, a document that laid out in painful specific detail exactly what the years of living in Camilla's shadow had truly done to Catherine. It described the nights Catherine wept herself to sleep while the palace refused to defend her. The mornings she hid her swollen eyes behind dark glasses and layers of heavy makeup before she stepped out to smile for all the cameras. The visible and truly alarming weight she had lost during her darkest periods, her frame shrinking under pressure that the public could see but that nobody in the institution would ever acknowledge. It detailed how the palace had, repeatedly, allowed the press to treat her as if she was secondary, less important, less interesting, less worthy of protection than Camilla, the woman who had once been its most despised figure. Catherine had given absolutely everything to this institution. She had followed every rule, smiled through every agonizing moment, and never once complained, publicly. And what did she get in return? The institution left her exposed while it wrapped Camilla in a shield of protection. Charles had read every single word of that report, and it shattered him because he had not, simply, witnessed what was done to Catherine over the years. He was part of it. He had chosen Camilla's comfort over Catherine's dignity publicly and repeatedly for years. He had enabled it, and now he was sitting all alone in a candle-lit room with absolutely no crown on his head and with nowhere left at all to hide from. What he had done. When Catherine walked through that door, the sitting king of the United Kingdom did something that kings simply do not do. He dropped to one knee right in front of his daughter-in-law. Just let that image settle in your mind for a moment, because it is almost impossible to fully comprehend. And then he pressed a ring into her, palm a plain, quiet ring from Queen Elizabeth's most private and personal collection, one that the Queen had worn during her own years of private grief after Prince Philip died. A ring that had never been photographed, never documented publicly, and never shown to the press in any form. It was the Queen's private sorrow made into a physical object that could actually be held and passed on, and so Charles took that object, his own mother's hidden grief, and he pressed it right into Catherine's hand. And then he said 8 words that reportedly brought Catherine to tears. You are the future I failed to protect. That is a full confession from a man on his knees. Catherine just stood there with tears streaming down her face. But what most people in that room did not fully understand was that this moment had not been improvised. It had not been planned by William. It had not been planned by Anne. It had been planned by a woman who had been dead for years and had seen all of this coming, long before anyone else in that palace knew what was actually happening. Because hidden deep inside the Windsor archives was a letter sealed private, and it changes every single thing you think you just understood about this entire story, the letter that she left behind, in the very final years of her reign as her health was failing and she was doing the quiet, painful work of preparing the monarchy for the world that would come after her. Queen Elizabeth wrote a letter, and she sealed it herself. She hid it inside the Windsor archives where only the most senior and most trusted palace aides could ever find it, a private document containing instructions and truths she apparently did not trust anyone to act on if they knew about them too early. It was only when William began his restructuring of the royal household that senior palace aides, while combing through decades of archive, documents deep inside Windsor, stumbled upon that sealed letter, and when they broke that seal and read what was inside, everything that had already been put in motion suddenly made complete and truly terrifying sense. In that letter the Queen named Catherine as the monarchy's final safeguard, not Charles, the one who wore the crown, not William, who would one day wear it after him, not Anne, her most fiercely trusted daughter, the woman she had leaned on for decades through the absolute hardest moments of her reign. Catherine, a woman without a single drop of royal blood, a woman who married into the institution as a young girl from a perfectly ordinary English family. Elizabeth. She had given 70 years of her life to keeping that institution alive through wars, scandals, and all kinds of crises that would have utterly destroyed lesser people, and she had looked at every person in that family with clear, unsentimental eyes. And she had decided that the one person truly capable of saving the crown was the one who had chosen the role, freely, not someone who was simply born into it, and was given no choice, someone who saw it clearly and understood its staggering cost completely, and still chose it anyway and had paid for that choice in ways the public only ever glimpsed. That letter reportedly laid out exactly why Elizabeth had chosen Catherine. Elizabeth wrote that Catherine was the only person in the whole family who genuinely understood that the monarchy's survival today depends entirely on public trust, and Catherine, after everything she had been forced to endure through all the press campaigns, designed to tear her down through the long years of isolation and being sidelined, had never once betrayed that trust. She had never secretly briefed a journalist to attack someone. She never leaked a damaging story just to protect herself. She had never used another person as a human shield, the exact way Camilla had operated her entire life. And in a family where that kind of survival tactic had long been considered a necessary tool, Catherine had quietly and consistently refused to use it. And Elizabeth had been watching that refusal for many years with a deep and growing admiration. But the letter did not end there. It contained something far darker, something that changed it from a statement of confidence in Catherine into a message that was far more urgent. Elizabeth had written a specific and incredibly direct warning about Camilla. She wrote that Camilla's continued presence at the heart of the monarchy would eventually become the institution's single greatest and most dangerous liability, that the decades of tabloid baggage, the deep public resistance that had never truly faded away, no matter how many years passed, and the way Camilla had been so aggressively gathering power and financial influence, all of it was pointing unmistakably toward a moment of institutional crisis so severe that the monarchy might not survive with its credibility in one piece. Elizabeth saw this coming. She wrote it down with her own hand. She sealed it and hid it away, and trusted one specific person to act on it at precisely the right moment. and that person was Princess Anne. This means everything Anne did was never just a family intervention driven by personal feelings of grief. Anne had known about that explosive letter for years. She had been carrying the burden of her mother's final orders for years, waiting for the moment when William's restructuring had finally weakened Camilla's position enough that the final move could be made cleanly and permanently. And the woman Elizabeth had chosen to carry the monarchy's moral future was now sitting alone in a candlelit chamber at Windsor holding Elizabeth's ring. With tears on her face, likely wondering if she was truly ready for the immense weight of what had just been placed into her hands, she was just about to find out, because while Catherine sat in that room absorbing what had just taken place, what was happening to Camilla on the other side of that night was the most savage and deliberate act of institutional destruction the modern British monarchy has ever performed in complete and total silence. So, this brings up a huge question for our story. If we are going to understand what happens next, we have to use this exact version of events. Now, this is the main issue. Why was Camilla even sent? Away was this whole thing made to look like it was permanent? It can't be. We are still going to see Camilla out in public. So is this just a temporary move or something else? What's the real exit plan, and where in this part of the story do we see these changes, what was actually left of Camilla? That nighttime removal served two purposes simultaneously, and both of them need to be stated very clearly to understand the stakes. The first purpose was punishment. Camilla was not simply asked to step back in a formal daytime process with her dignity and a team of lawyers. She was removed in the dead of night with her access totally revoked and her identity stripped away before she even knew the full scale of what was happening to her. This was a deliberate act of humiliation. The palace was making sure she felt every single layer of what was being ripped away from her. The second and much more powerful purpose was a clear message of dominance. By doing it, at night, with no press around, no official records, and no public explanation, the palace was telling Camilla something very specific. We do not need a public process to completely destroy you. We do not need any cameras or announcements or official procedures. We can take everything from you in complete and total silence, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. Because to the outside world, none of this ever actually happened. And that is the most terrifying kind of power. A power that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. By dawn, Camilla had simply vanished, and the way she left told you everything about what had just been inflicted upon her. She did not walk out. Through the grand main entrance she'd used confidently as queen consort for years. She left Clarence House through a side entrance, a narrow, unremarkable door used by the staff, the cleaners, the bag carriers, and all the people who are never in any photographs and are never meant to be seen. That was the specific door they pointed her toward, and if you understand the slightest thing about how the British monarchy communicates power, you know, without a doubt that was not some logistical decision. That was a message delivered in the most precise and humiliating language the institution had in its arsenal, and the humiliation began long before she even got to that door. Her keycard access to palace systems had been revoked before she even reached her car. Her lady-in-waiting, the woman who had served by her side through years of public service, received a formal termination notice that very night. And William, who had been strategically taking apart Camilla's power base for months while everyone else was distracted, had issued a very specific order to palace communications. Camilla was to be formally classified as a private individual for a minimum of 48 hours. Now really think about what that classification meant in real terms. It meant she had no royal security briefings and no palace legal representation of any kind. It also meant no ability to release a single statement under the royal household's name. It meant she had no institutional identity, zero official standing, and no way whatsoever she could respond to what was being done to her. the woman who spent 30 years of her life fighting ferociously to be, recognised as a legitimate part of the British royal family, was reclassified overnight as just an ordinary civilian while she was still physically standing inside her own home. What happened next left her even more surprised. Camilla picked up her phone and called her husband. For 2 whole days Charles refused to take her call. The woman he had loved for decades, the one he had sacrificed so much to stand beside, was calling him from wherever. She had gone, and he simply would not answer. Sources inside the palace say she spent those 48 hours in complete isolation. No explanation from anyone about what had just happened or what would come next. There was just silence from every direction, but here is the part about that silence that makes it even darker. Palace insiders now suggest that Charles was not just too devastated to speak to her. He was being held to a condition that William had reportedly made crystal clear to his father. If he broke and contacted Camilla during that window, if he wavered even, slightly or tried in any way to soften the blow of what had been done, William would move forward releasing all of their findings straight to the press. Charles wasn't just sitting in his grief, he was utterly cornered. And while Camilla sat completely alone with no calls, no answers, and no institutional identity, the palace delivered its final and most devastating statement. Inside the palace's hall of matriarchs, a corridor built specifically to honour the great women of the monarchy, Camilla's portrait was unceremoniously ripped down from the wall. No explanation was offered to anyone inside or outside of the palace. It was torn from its place in the dead of night and replaced with a portrait of Catherine. Camilla's era was officially over. Her face was erased from the wall built to honour her. Now here is what you have to understand with absolute clarity before we go any further. This was not a permanent legal removal. On paper, Camilla still holds the title of Queen Consort. She will still appear at public events. No actual law was changed that night, and no official announcement was ever made to the public, which was precisely the point. But what was taken from her that night was everything that made her title mean anything at all. It was taken because of what William's audit had finally uncovered: the deliberate funneling of Duchy of Cornwall charitable funds directly into her own patronage network, the financial manipulation of the monarchy's resources for her own personal gain. That was the shocking discovery that turned this from a slow institutional push into an immediate, decisive removal. The title stayed in place, but everything behind it was surgically hollowed out, and within the British monarchy a title with nothing behind it is not a position. It is a gilded cage. The title of Queen Consort technically still belongs to her on paper, but a title without access, without any institutional support, without a husband who answers the phone, and without a face on the palace wall is nothing more than a word. And words without power inside the British monarchy mean absolutely nothing. Nothing, not a thing. In fact, Catherine's office is now taking over the royal patronages. All correspondence to the king is now filtered directly through her team before anyone else sees it. Senior aides across the palace are now answering to Catherine, and Princess Anne hasn't left her side in weeks, standing guard over every crucial decision with that same icy precision she used in that room at Clarence House, making absolutely sure that no one makes a move against Catherine while this transition is still taking shape. And William is the architect of this whole new system, operating from behind the scenes, completely and deliberately. Invisible, totally untouchable, and placing his wife right at the centre of the monarchy's public moral authority, all while he pulls every single operational string from the shadows. The monarchy has chosen its path forward, in the dark, in total silence, without ever telling the British public a single thing about it.